Good evening and welcome to the Macrum Lecture Theatre. This evening's expert panel on artificial intelligence is presented by the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion and is a part of the wider Cambridge Festival of Ideas, 2 weeks of over 200 events to incite and inspire. My name is Dr. Beth Singler. I'll be chairing the panel this evening. I'm a research associate at the Faraday Institute, where I am working on a project considering the implications of artificial intelligence and robotics. So I'll begin with Professor Margaret Boden to my right. She is a research professor of cognitive science at the University of Sussex, where she helped develop the world's first academic program to combine AI with philosophy, psychology, and linguistics. She holds degrees in medical sciences, philosophy, and psychology, and integrates these disciplines with AI in her research. She is a fellow of the British Academy and of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence and its British and European equivalents. She is also a scientific advisor for CSER, that's the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. Her work has been translated into 20 languages. Her books include The Creative Mind, Myths and Mechanisms, and Mind as Machine, A History of Cognitive Science, and in June of this year, AI, Its Nature and Future. Sitting next to Professor Boden is Jaan Tallinn. Jaan Tallinn is a founding engineer of Skype and Kazaa. He is a co-founder of the Future of Life Institute and CSER, and philanthropically supports other existential risk research organizations. He is also a partner at Ambient Sound Investments, an active angel investor, and has served on the Estonian President's Academic Advisory Board. He has given a number of high-profile talks highlighting the potential risk from advances in artificial intelligence. Dr. Adrian Weller, next to Jaan Tallinn, is a senior researcher in the Machine Learning Group at the University of Cambridge in the Computational and Biological Learning Lab. He received his PhD in computer science, specializing in machine learning at Columbia University. He is also a faculty fellow at the Alan Turing Institute and is affiliated with CSER, the Centre for Science and Policy as well, and the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence. Previously, Adrian worked in finance and continues to be actively involved as an angel investor. He has also been engaged with interfaith work for many years. And finally, at the end, Professor John Wyatt. Professor John Wyatt was Professor of Ethics and Perinatology at the University of College London. He has worked as a consultant neonatologist at University College Hospital for more than 20 years, but is now concentrating on teaching and research into ethical dilemmas raised by advances in technology. He is chair of the Medical Study Group of the Christian Medical Fellowship and a board member of BioCentre. He is a member of the Ethics Committee of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health and has been frequently involved in professional and media debates on ethical issues concerning the beginning and end of life. He is also my boss, as the principal investigator on the Faraday Institute project considering human identity in the age of nearly human machines. Thank you very much all for coming along to the event this evening, and I'd like to hand over to Professor Boden to introduce her perspective on artificial intelligence, its future and ours.
Thanks, Beth, and good evening, everybody. My core interest is actually the human mind, what it is, how it works, how it relates to the brain, how it relates to our evolutionary history. And my interests for many, many years now in artificial intelligence and artificial life are because those two areas, they're really all one big area, I would say, those two areas give us a host of concepts which are really, really helpful, both at the philosophical and psychological level for thinking about those questions about the human mind. And I'm also very interested, in fact, increasingly so, given what's happening in the world out there, also interested in the social implications of AI, and in particular, I mean, there are so many, but in particular, in the ways in which it might affect the way in which we relate to it to one another, and the ways in which we think about what a human being is, and what a human-human relationship should be.
Excellent. And Jaan Tallinn, if you'd like to say a few words.
I would start with a story. Imagine a domestic robot, and it's your robot. You tell it to go to the kitchen and fetch some coffee. Now, there's one problem in the kitchen. You have some refurbishment ongoing, and there's a big hole in the floor. And the robot will actually go around that hole. It wouldn't fall into the hole because it's sufficiently advanced. And the reason why it went around that hole wasn't because it's conscious. No, it's not because it has a fear of death. No, because it was just sufficiently advanced to make the correct prediction that if it falls into that hole, it will not be able to fetch the coffee. Now the thing is, if you replace that hole with a human-operated off switch, and if the robot is sufficiently advanced, it will also make the correct prediction that if it's going to be turned off, it's not going to be able to fetch the coffee. So the problem that humanity still has no answer for is really kind of trivial. How do we turn off systems that are sufficiently advanced to predict the consequences of being turned off? And for the last 7 years or so, I've been trying to kind of increase humanity's ability to do research into these topics. And luckily, I see that these efforts of mine and people like me are starting to bear fruit. For example, just earlier this year in June, Google DeepMind, which is I think one of the most, if not the most advanced AI group in the world, together with the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, published a paper. I think it was called something like Interactability in Reinforcement Agents, or something like that, where they proposed a new architecture showing that in principle and under some assumptions, so it wasn't very strong conclusion, you can turn off reinforcement agents if you kind of architect them properly. And I do think that there is a great need for, because this was just one problem that I described, that's how to turn off sufficiently advanced agents. But even if there is in principle a way to turn them off, you might not be able to because they're just too quick. So we need to do research into how to make sure that they proceed slowly, how they are more transparent, how they try to avoid catastrophic side effects, so on and so forth. And in a big strategic view, I think it's time we should stop relying on sort of external control mechanisms that we have so far used for all of our tools, and everything sort of even like economic concepts, where you have like a system, you expect that what to do with a tool, what to do with an organization, that sort of comes from outside, from the society, from the owners or whatnot. But as we have moved to increasingly autonomous systems, that situation might no longer hold. Therefore, we need to do research into what's called value alignment. How do we build systems that are sort of automatically try to do what we want to do, instead of us kind of monitoring them and making sure that we are quick enough to turn them off, even if they don't necessarily want to.
Great, thank you very much. And Dr. Adrian Weller, if you'd like to introduce your work.
Perhaps I'd like to start by echoing something that Maggie said, and I'll end with coming back to something that Jaan said. What could be a more profound and more important question than trying to understand the human condition? So what is human intelligence? What is a human soul? Is there a greater power? If so, how can we relate to that? And how can we determine what is ultimately right and wrong? So if those questions of human intelligence are in some sense ultimately the most important question, what else could compare? So I suggest that one line of recent work has shown us that actually maybe we should think about not just human intelligence, but intelligence more broadly. And I'm thinking, before we get onto AI, let's think perhaps about animals. So we've seen increasingly over the last few decades that aspects of human intelligence which we thought were unique to ourselves, unique to, as the Bible might say, the only creature which is created in the image of God, we increasingly see that there are animals which do pretty much everything. There are animals that exhibit a sense of social justice. There are animals which seem to have a theory of mind, such as dogs. So just by looking at those other forms of intelligence already starts making us question some of our assumptions about our place in the universe and the specialness of humans. And now turning to artificial intelligence, that's an area where we've seen tremendous progress in the last few decades, and perhaps we're seeing accelerating progress, so that we're at a period now which seems to be one which is going to lead to really the biggest shift in the rate of learning or evolution or development since the beginning of mankind, perhaps since the beginning of life anywhere as we know it. So this is a very important time, and we're seeing the development of powerful technologies that give us tremendous opportunities. So I'm very excited about AI. I'm very excited about the possibilities for doing things like curing diseases, which we wouldn't know how to do otherwise, or perhaps for just increasing economic efficiency tremendously. But with these tremendous opportunities, with these superpowers that we have, come super responsibilities. And we should think very carefully about the social impacts of artificial intelligence, both in the near term and the long term. So in the near term, there are clearly significant worries from things like jobs which may be displaced by machines, and from trying to ensure that we get a fair distribution of the benefits which will come from artificial intelligence. And in the long run, we may come to a time, and it's something we perhaps will debate, that just like some aspects of intelligence which we see in animals make us question our own specialness, we may come to a time when artificial intelligence makes us question whether is an AI conscious, does an AI have a soul, questions like that. We're probably a fair way off from that. But one of the issues which will be important as we get closer to that is the topic that Jaan mentioned. So can we give them a good set of values? Can we figure out which values we want them to have, and can we then ensure that they will follow those values? And just one thing I'd mention is that by making us think about what values we'd like a superintelligence to have, it does make us, I think, very helpfully reflect back on ourselves and think about what values we should have for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Professor Wyatt.
Well, I want to echo a lot of what's been said already, and I think that the potential benefits that AI and robotics can bring to humankind is enormous, and we can have only a little inkling of it. But it's interesting in the history of ideas how human beings have often used the best technology of the time to try and understand themselves. And so historically in the past, in an age like in the clockwork, that in the time of the Enlightenment, that human beings were understood themselves as some kind of clockwork mechanisms, or in an age of hydraulics, that it's the hydraulic explanations of human functioning became dominant. And so it's not surprising that increasingly ideas of human beings as being intelligent machines are very current in contemporary culture. So on the one hand, we understand ourselves in the light of the technology with which we are confronted, and at the same time there's a movement in the opposite direction in that we tend to anthropomorphize. We put our own human identity onto machines. And I'm concerned about the potential abuse and manipulation that these kind of processes can lead to, particularly in the area of companion robots or so on, and the ability of machines to simulate what has been up till now been thought of as distinctively human virtues, such as compassion, sympathy, friendship, and so on. It does seem to me that there are real manipulative possibilities, and particularly as the economic arguments for having companion robots will become, I think, increasingly pressing, given the cost of human carers, the cost of human companions, and so on. So I think we do need to think seriously about what the implications of simulated companionship, simulated carers may be in many areas of medicine and other aspects of social care. And I find it concerning that so far, so much of this field is being driven by effectively laissez-faire economics. It's capitalist economics which is driving this. And there's very little in the sense of democratic supervision or oversight of advances in these areas. And so I want to ask the question, what would an appropriate democratic supervision, democratic regulation look like? How might this very powerful technology be used in a way that will be genuinely for the common good, that will reinforce genuinely human interaction. And perhaps finally, in an age where increasingly, as has been said, that what we previously thought of being uniquely human competences, many of these functions can be taken over by machines, then the question is, what are human beings for? What are the unique contribution that human beings have to make in a world increasingly dominated by intelligent machines?
Excellent, thank you very much. And now we will open up to questions from the audience, from yourselves. I believe somewhere there's a microphone. Excellent. So hands up, make yourselves known, and we will pass the microphones along to you.
Because there's no aisles, you have to be hard.
Yes.
Hello, my name's Ben. Less of a question, more I'd just like to early on introduce into the conversation something to depolarize it. We often hear about the machines and us, and there is already the idea of transhumanism. This is combining with the machines, and I think that's really important balancing for the conversation. Effectively, by carrying a smartphone, we're already mildly transhuman. We are more intelligent with it, and it is more capable with us than it is sitting on a desk on its own. And I think this is very important perspective on it, the idea of combining with machines in a more and more internal way inside the skin. It doesn't matter, but...
Yeah, I think it's one of the possible scenarios that we indeed kind of become more and more cyber as we work on the better and better interfaces to our machines. Whether it's a good thing or bad thing, I don't actually have a strong opinion there. I do suspect that it's somewhat unstable, though, because you're combining a system that wasn't really built for that with a system that's kind of increasingly more powerful. Like in one of my talks, I had this slide with a speeding train that is basically in focus, and the background is completely blurred. And you can see it's coming at you like with like 200 miles an hour or something like that. And then I wrote under it that who here wanted to merge again? Because like the problem might be that these things will become too fast, too quickly for us to actually be joining with them. But otherwise, yeah, like if that's not the case, then that's one plausible outcome.
Anyone else want to join in on that?
It's just interesting that IBM is no longer using the phrase artificial intelligence. It sort of seems to be focusing entirely on the concept of augmented intelligence. And I think this is partly a commercial decision to try and demystify or reduce the fears of these machines taking over. And of course one can see the power, the idea that these technologies enhance human ability. But I think it's a little naive, I mean, a bit as you say, to believe that it may not increasingly replace human abilities as well. And so I think the challenge is still the question, yes, there are aspects in which the blurring between what it means to be human and what it means to be machine, that's undoubtedly true, but I think I would still want to ask the question about, are there distinctive things about being human which machines can never or ought to never to replace?
Yeah, that's a very fundamental question.
Well, yes, and even if you think, as I do myself, excuse me, that in principle there is nothing that human beings can do, that the human mind can do, which some sort of computational system could do, it doesn't follow that in practice we will ever be able to achieve that. It may just be too complicated, too subtle, too rich. And my own view would be, if it ever happens at all, it certainly isn't going to happen very soon. I would say absolutely no way in this century. And if that's true, then it follows that anything that we do use in this century, and certainly in the foreseeable future, to interact with human beings in the sorts of contexts I think you're thinking about, John, is actually not going to be augmenting our intelligence, except perhaps in rather narrow and really rather boring areas. It's going to be actually is going to be offering too little challenge to us. It's going to be offering no genuine comfort. I mean, you were talking, and I think this is something which I'm very interested in, about computer carers. There are these AI systems that are supposed to be provided to, for example, an old person either living at home but with nobody visiting them, very little human contact, or living in an old people's home where the carers don't have, the human carers don't have time to interact with them very much, and they are not visited much, if at all, by their family. That these systems, it's said, will be able to offer comfort and conversation and conviviality and a sort of emotional support for these people. Well, frankly, this freezes my blood for two reasons. First of all, I think they are in fact going to be so far away from that they could actually be very dangerous and not as helpful as is thought. And secondly, even if they were advanced enough to appear to be able to do this, I think that would be a terrible assault, a disrespectful assault on the human dignity of that person. And I think it should not be done. So even if it could be done, I think it should not be done. And I agree, I think there should be regulations. We should start thinking now about regulations for these things, because they're already starting to appear in the marketplace.
So first, just addressing your point on transhumanism, we should keep in perspective that for centuries we've had technologies which in some ways augment the human mind. Writing and reading allows us to recall facts which otherwise we wouldn't be able to. And I'm sure at first there were some people who thought it was maybe a bad idea and dangerous, but it seemed to work okay. But one of the differences is that these technologies seem to be coming along at an increasing pace. So it's just hard to stay on top and hard to be able to know whether things are okay. So at a minimum, it's naturally worrying, although maybe it's also exciting too, but it's something to be cautious about. Another aspect of it is that it could be the case that certain technologies will be available for those who can afford them, but not for others, which potentially at some point in the not too distant future might be really life-changing things. That you can imagine life extension for some and not others, which has received a lot of attention and interest. And just coming back to Maggie's point, I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for the point that she makes, but I also am a little bit loath to rush into thinking about regulation, or rush into regulation. It's very sensible to think about the regulation. For one reason, because you can imagine many situations when the threshold to do better than what's already in place is actually quite low. There are plenty of people who are looked after very poorly, and they may be very happy to have what we might consider to be a poor copy of a person. They may really want it, and if so, who are we to tell them no? But I recognize it's a difficult issue.
Yeah, my worry with the regulation is that it's like almost like driving in a screw with a sledgehammer. So it's going to be messy, and you have to be really desperate to do that. That said, obviously, we should start at least thinking about it, like what kind of things we might be useful to put in place once we actually are fairly confident that they're going to actually have the intended effect.
We have questions over that side. Start there.
It sort of picks up on your point, really. I'm a communicator, and I attend a lot of Cambridge panel discussions and interview guest speakers, but clearly Cambridge is light years ahead with understanding this technology, and the public doesn't yet. In fact, you hear a lot that's very misleading about it. So could each of you say in turn 2 or 3 things that you think we need as a general public to be thinking about now if we want to in any way shape our future as a society within the advances that are taking place with AI? So 2 or 3 things that you think the public ought to be deciding that you, the experts, know and we don't.
Well, at the top of my list would be the one that we've been talking about, the sort of social care. And of course, so-called robot nannies that are sort of very close, so a lot of problems there. And I think people should understand how these apparently language-using systems work. The way that they're described, certainly by the people who are trying to sell them, and very often by the people who are actually working on them and researchers, they're described as understanding the language and the concepts that they're using. Well, I think people should, we should try to help them to realize that what's going on there is fancy statistics. These things are matching up words and phrases that we use, which we use, and they sometimes appear together, because we understand them. And it's true that by using these fancy statistics, today's language-using programs can be far more useful and apparently understand, heavy quotes here, understand far more than they could even a few years ago, never mind 50 years ago. But they understand zero. And I think the public should understand, no quotes, that they understand zero. I think that's very important.
Is that why you wouldn't want to see them as carers?
Yes.
So one sort of thought experiment I think that would be really valuable for everyone, including general public, to do is that what kind of future do we actually want? Especially given in two assumptions. So one assumption is that resources are not going to be a problem. We're going to have the resources of the entire universe at our disposal. Actually, there's just really interesting a paper coming out from Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford talking about the probability that we are alone. It looks like we have severely underestimated the probability that we are actually alone in the universe. So yes, we might have the entire resource of the universe at our disposal. And the other assumption that you have to make is that it's the veil of ignorance. You don't know which member of the society you're going to be, because if you already assume, oh, I'm going to be the king, then you're going to get really the thought exercise is not going to be useful. So think about what could we do with enormous resources, assuming that I don't know exactly where I will end up in this society. So we really have to think hard about the common good.
My personal view on three topics that I think are perhaps most pressing for us as a society to be thinking about, and I completely agree with you. These are societal issues, and we should be trying to have a debate across as broad a segment of society as possible. One issue is privacy of data. So many of us effectively hand over our data to Google, to Facebook. Many of us weren't so sure if it was okay when our friends did it and they seemed all right, so we do it, and this sort of thing keeps happening, but we don't really know if it's going to be okay. And this whole thing is evolving in a way that's a bit out of people's control, and it's something that's well worth having a widespread debate about. The second topic I'd say relates to the economy, and perhaps particularly in two areas. One is jobs that I touched upon before, so we may have really big changes in jobs. People talk about the Industrial Revolution. This could be on that scale, or perhaps could be significantly bigger, and we need to think about what to do about that. And so people talk about generally three kinds of responses. One is we need to find better ways to educate people and continually re-educate them over their lives. I think that's very important, and that's great. People also talk about trying to oil the wheels of entrepreneurship to allow people to set up companies more flexibly, and I agree that's also great. But a third thing which may need to be done and will be very important, but is going to be politically very difficult, so we should start to be thinking about it now, is large-scale redistribution. It's always very difficult, but if we're going to manage to get anywhere, we need to start thinking about it now. And clearly some people are, through thinking about things like universal basic income, which I think is one interesting idea. The third area I'd mention relates to the law. So I'll just give one example there. Many of you may have seen there was some controversy in the States where some judges who are trying to decide whether or not to grant parole to people in prison use a third-party system from a company. They use a product called, the acronym is COMPAS, and this is a private system which looks at the data on an individual and then gives a risk assessment about the probability that they'll commit a crime again. Now, the judge will use that in deciding whether or not to grant parole. I see at least 3 issues to think about there. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, but there are at least 3 causes for possible concern. One is it okay to be using a private system which is closed so people don't really know how it's working? Is that okay? Secondly, is it okay that, is it okay that, as has been shown, it seems to make errors that appear to be biased? So people have analyzed it and they've discovered that it seems to overestimate the chance that black people will recommit a crime, and it seems to underestimate the chance that white people will commit a crime. Certainly on the face of it, that seems terrible and seems like something needs to be done to fix that. But it raises this big question of, okay, well what needs to be done? What exactly would be required of a fair system? If you could put in some constraint that it's going to have the equal probability of errors for those different groups, but that could radically throw off the probability of error, so or the chance of error. So I think these are some of the really important debates we need to have soon.
I would certainly echo a lot of that. I think the question of democratic accountability in the introduction of this new technology, my own background in healthcare makes me think a lot about how the AI is increasingly going to be used in many different aspects of healthcare, issues of privacy of medical information, and a question of democratic oversight. A lot of this, again, is being driven by commercial interests, and I think it's important for the public to be aware of the enormous commercial interests that are underneath in this area. And I think, again, as already been said, we need to ask our question: what kind of society do we want to have for the future? That this technology is enormously powerful, but are we just going to allow free market economics to lead the way in terms of building a society? Or we need to ask in particular, what are the distinctively human virtues which we want the technology to support and enhance and protect?
Great, thank you. We had questions. The gentleman in the dark jumper there. Thank you.
It seems to me that if we're not going to make a total mess of having a fair amount of artificial intelligence distributed throughout the culture, we're going to have to understand human intelligence better. And it's kind of depressing to think that the vast majority of the population of the planet has no idea, other than a certain basic folk psychology and mythology, about how human brains even begin to work. And we're not really addressing this in the culture, certainly not in the educational system. I have a 5-year-old daughter whom I think should be learning the rudiments of cognitive psychology now, and not waiting until she has to deal with whether or not an artificial intelligence is real or not 30 or 40 years from now. And I'm curious what you think of that.
Well, I would agree with that, but I would say that she shouldn't be learning about how the brain works, which I think was sort of how you put it. She should be learning about what is the sort of information processing or computation, if you like, which the brain is doing. In other words, she'd be thinking about the human mind rather than about the human brain. The interesting thing about the human brain, for these purposes, it seems to me, is what it enables the human person to do. And that's what's important, and that's what people indeed don't understand. And but we understand it far better now than we did 50 years ago, thanks to these computational concepts.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there's a lot of value in studying human intelligence and human psychology in general. One way of putting it is that like it's kind of dangerous to give like nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs to monkeys. So and perhaps something even more powerful. So one way to try to solve the sort of really potentially unstable future is try to make the technologies more domestic, like less dangerous. But the other way is to actually make us smarter, try to make us smarter. In fact, the organization that kind of attracted me to these topics, it was called Singularity Institute. Back, I think that was in 2008 or something. And they have now going to split into two organizations. One is called Machine Intelligence Research Institute, which is doing like hardcore mathematical research into how do you create agents that create agents and then prove invariants along the way, so to make actually the process more predictable. But the other organization is called, and at the website for Machine Intelligence Research Institute is intelligence.org. But the other offshoot from the parent organization is called CFAR, Center for Applied Rationality. It's called rationality.org. And the idea there is indeed, like in order to actually face the challenges that we're going to get from increasing powerful technology, wouldn't it be crucial to make people more rational and more kind of, wise in certain sense of the word? So yes.
That's actually where I was coming from, because I'm aware of what they do.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm a supporter of both organizations.
Any questions in the middle at the back there?
Hi. I think the 2 questions ago, you guys actually raised a question that actually brought to mind an article that The Guardian ran about AI actually. Homo sapiens will be split into a handful of gods and the rest of us. And we're actually seeing it today in terms of how Facebook and Google is actually dominating a lot in the world. And the thing is that I think one of the speakers did mention about the idea of a universal income. But the thing is that from that concept, because with today's markets, we realize that capitalism will increasingly cause like the people who own AI to actually get more market wealth to actually even to consolidate their own power. So then I would just like to ask the panel, what kind of economic model will you foresee us to adopt in the future to ensure that this doesn't happen, where all our powers will be concentrated with the market leaders in terms of like AI?
I wish I knew, but we need it. We need something. I think it's a huge danger.
And myself, I don't actually spend that much time thinking about what I call short-term issues, which I'm really happy that some people do spend. And also, so some people do spend a fair bit of thinking about issues like technological unemployment and how do we actually reorganize society as the technology might become bigger and bigger power concentrator. But myself, I'm really focusing on the long-term issues. So once you have something that no longer needs human economy, and how.
Because the thing is that if you think about it, you actually shift the power away from world leaders to actually the technology go owners. So next time it could be that Facebook, the CEO of Facebook has more to say than your world leader in the US, which will be a bit ridiculous if you think about it. You will destabilize the entire political system. And I just want to ask, like, because the panel has probably dealt with this issue a lot longer than me, I just like to ask if there's anything that you might add that could contribute to like future developments in this field, to the new world order.
Yeah, so I mean, my contribution generally has been to invest in AI companies so I could hang around in their kitchens and talk about these issues. And like, so it's, and I think it has really worked. The growing awareness among AI companies that they're not just doing yet another technology, but actually, like, sometimes I say that it could look at AI research that humanity is doing and say that humanity is in the process of searching for the best possible future for itself, with an important caveat that we are going to be irrevocably committing to the first result that we find. So we should better be really careful and wise about the search process itself. And yes, there are many pitfalls along the way. But yeah, indeed, myself, I've focused less on these problems. I've focused more on problems where we just have systems that cannot be controlled by anyone, and how do we avoid that kind of fate.
So a few comments. You started by talking about perhaps the gods and the have-nots, which is an exciting phrase, but I don't think we're anywhere close to that. Many people would say now. I think when most people think about that, they're thinking about a possible future at least probably several decades away, where the wealthy perhaps were able to afford some technologies that, for example, allowed them to live much longer, cure them of diseases, which other people wouldn't be able to do. And I think that might be a possibility which we should try to avoid, but it's probably some way off. On the other hand, pointing out that people like Google and Facebook have a lot more data than almost anyone else, and that potentially that's forming a moat around them so that it's very hard for people to compete with them, is a valid point. But the issue of having oligopolies which have powers which are inappropriate and perhaps require being disrupted is something which has existed for a long time within the legal framework. So the old oil companies were disrupted. So there is a framework for thinking about that. You can force breakups. I'm not saying that that's been analyzed correctly. I'm just pointing out there is an existing framework, and it is something which should be considered and thought about. Of course, the other thing to point out is that even though we're now thinking that these are enormous companies that could never be shifted, they've only been around for a brief period of time. And when Google came along, no one would have dreamt that they could take over from Alta Vista, which was the leading web search at the time. So although it seems as if we have these huge companies and they're very stable, in fact, it's probably a time of greater instability than ever before, where new companies start to rise up. So it's hard to tell whether or not there is really an issue.
Luckily, right now we're still in the regime where countries tend to be more powerful than corporations, which has not always been the case, by the way. So it's like we shouldn't actually kind of rely on that regime, but we still could use that regime.
Yes. Picking up on that, which was also one of your points, I think it will be a concern at some point, and we should start to think about issues like, to what extent does social media subtly have a controlling effect on us? So, and potentially, could an evil Facebook control who wins the election in the States, for example? And conceivably they could. If it was a close election, you could imagine they could push stories that would make people go one way or the other, and we'd all think, I think that would be a bit dangerous. But having gone through that thought experiment, what they are already doing is they're pushing stories which they think are in their commercial interest, and that might be having an unconscious effect on what's going to happen. My sense is that it's not a big deal yet, but it's something which we should be thinking about carefully now.
I think one of the recurring themes in religious thinking about changes in society is this theme of the common good. What will defend and protect the common good for us as a community, rather than so much in capitalism is about individual the rights of individuals to accumulate wealth and capitalism and so on. So I'm reminded of words by C.S. Lewis, who, writing at the end of the Second World War about technology, said that man's power over nature turns out to be power exerted by some men over other men. So what starts off as the subduing of nature actually turns out to be reinforcing power structures. And I think we see that today. So I think it has to be democracy, has to be the biggest force which can subdue this raw capitalist drives. And at the moment, I think that's why education of the population as a whole is so vital, to understand the hidden powers that are behind so much of this. Now, how we actually do that, I don't know, but I certainly would also think that we need more discussion about this idea of a universal basic income. I think the predictions of the amount of unemployment that is potentially going to come in the next foreseeable 1 to 2 decades, even if they're only partially right, that potentially this could be enormously socially disruptive. One of the really depressing things is a recent study suggested that this was going to have a particular impact in low-resource countries, so that the impact of technology was likely to be greater in low-resource countries than it is in rich countries such as the UK. And so I think we really do need to think about how, both as a country but as a global community, how we mitigate against these potentially immensely disruptive powers of artificial intelligence.
By the way, there's a very interesting overlap between what we're right now talking about, how do we actually kind of involve more people in the kind of shaping the outcome. And what I mentioned earlier, the value alignment. The value alignment problem is how do you make sure that machines do what is kind of good for humanity. In order to do that, you need to solve two problems. One is to actually make machines robust enough, make sure that they're not going to deviate from the goals or meta goals that we're going to give them. But the other problem is actually figuring out what do we really want. So as I sometimes say that the philosophers have had like thousands of years to kind of write interesting books and think about interesting things, but now we need answers. And those answers have to be in computer code. So the time is running out.
Okay, questions. Let's bring some down to the front. This lady here, can you get round? No, sorry, Eleanor. We've got one person running with a microphone.
But while I run, you can tweet. There is Wi-Fi.
Tweet.
Hi. I recently heard a neuroscientist say something very interesting, and I wonder what you think. He basically said that robots are innately flawed because they're made by us, and they imitate us, and we are very bad decision makers because our processing software is very limited and we can't consider all the possibilities in the world, so we make quite bad decisions. And then he referenced Google DeepMind and said that it recently made a mistake and it got depressed, it got self-conscious, and it started making more and more mistakes because it went back on its mistakes, analyzing them and thinking, oh God, why am I making a mistake? Basically, just like a human being. And he said, well, that's a real problem. This is why artificial intelligence will not be better than us, will not be able to take over the world, because they will be just as limited as us. What do you think?
Well, I mean, first of all, we are not as limited as evolution. So we are created by something that's I think is dumber than us, at least in some respect. It never figured out how to do radios. It never figured out how to do firearms, for example. And like, yeah, human eye is a horrible piece of engineering if you look at it, actually. And like no engineer in their right mind would like do something silly mistakes like that. And I do think that humans actually have fairly good grasp by now, like in what's called decision theory, like how to actually make optimal decisions. Doesn't mean that we are able to do those decisions ourselves, but they have some theoretical underpinnings. So like, I don't think that neuroscientist was very well aware of how actually AI is built. So it's not like we just like threw a bunch of code on the wall and ask it to imitate us. No, actually there's a very rigorous process that goes into building and training them.
Anyone else want to come in on that? Or? Okay, more questions. What? Yeah, in the middle.
Thanks for being an amazing panel. I'm from an organisation called Future Advocacy, and we're putting out a report on Tuesday which looks at some of these issues we've been discussing about what citizens and government need to know and do to maximise the huge opportunities of AI and minimise the significant risks. Sorry, blatant plug, sorry about that. My question is, we haven't spoken at all about the military application of AI, so I wanted just to ask how concerned we should be about the use of deployment of AI to allow weapons to become more autonomous.
So, Future of Life Institute, one of the institutes that I co-founded at MIT, issued an open letter, I think earlier this year, about autonomous weapons, and myself and many other people have signed it. The big problem with autonomous weapons isn't that they are kind of able to make the current warfare. I mean, the advocates would say that it basically can make the warfare sort of bloodless, and it's kind of really kind of, it can't be optimal to just throw like a bunch of 19-year-olds there to make decisions about human lives. Now the the really big problem with autonomous weapons is that they are going to change the nature of warfare. So you, in some ways, you're going to disentangle your military power from the amount of 19-year-olds that you have, which means that the 5 guys with 2 big trucks can release 10 million autonomous weapons on a city. So it's a godsend for terrorists. So I think like the heads of state should like really think hard how to avoid the especially like arms races in autonomous weapons, and I'm really concerned about them not doing that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Actually, going back to something before about learning, human beings, I think it relates to a bit more of what you were speaking about. We're constantly evolving and learning, and we do things like read between the lines, and we have intuition, and often we kind of predict things without knowing how we actually did it. But with the conceptual mind, it's actually probably the unconditioned consciousness before it becomes the psychological entity and mind, which is what AI is going to somehow replicate. So how wouldn't a robot be obsolete as soon as you've made it, because it's kind of just what we know now, which is what we don't really know now. You know, it's all of our limitations as they are now is the best of what we think we are. So it's kind of not really, because as human beings we're improving all of the time. So with a machine, it will be stuck in time. How will it have an inbuilt kind of updating and learning process as well, or?
Well,
there's a question in there somewhere.
It will be able to learn.
Sorry?
Presumably it will be able to learn as we can, so that it can change. Whether it improves with the change is another issue, but it will change. And it might also have evolutionary processes in it, because, you know, there are many computer programs that can evolve, change themselves by evolution, to get a better outcome, to get, you know, that assumes, of course, that one has criteria for what counts as a better outcome. But exactly. No, I mean, I don't see them as being stuck in time at all.
In fact, I suggest it's an important point is perhaps to see in a way the opposite. So first, there's a whole field called machine learning, which is dedicated to trying to see how machines can learn. But going back to a point that Jaan made before, evolution was advancing at what we would consider to be a very slow pace in terms of how it learned how to do things compared to the speed at which humans can learn to do things. And we're now entering an age where actually machines are able to learn at potentially a much faster rate again. So I wouldn't think of them as standing still. I would say there are many techniques we can use to try to help them learn. There are even techniques which they can take and then themselves try and figure out for themselves new ways to learn, so that we could get what's classically called an explosion of intelligence with these machines improving themselves at a very rapid pace. So I think it's more likely that we'll see them advance very quickly. That's much more likely than seeing them stand still. And even if they do stand still, a feature of a lot of the algorithms which are being used today is that if nothing changes about the processes which are used, but all that happens is they get more data, which is available all the time, and they run faster, which is happening all the time, then they'll perform much better.
And I think this is one of the worries about the concentration of power. So, for instance, Google is sitting on this enormous concentration of data on its servers. About every single computer search done through Google since it started is sitting there effectively on the servers. Google is investing enormously in robotics, and the idea would be that as Google rolls out robot entities of whatever kind, they would have instant access in the cloud to this vast amount of data sitting on Google servers, which is constantly being updated, and so it's that concentration of power in one commercial company which gives a lot of us a real concern, and these are the kind of issues about how do we control that power how do we make sure that that power is used for the common good?
Yes. Well, I was just about to say it's still. I think my concern is how can it possibly replace intuition? What you were saying about what it means to be human and what human traits are there that can't be replaced. I mean, and like reading between the line, often we kind of infer things. I mean, will they be able to do that? Is that something? And also, with it being based on, the learning is based on language, words. What about non-conceptual learning and intelligence? Particularly if one meditates, one has access to a different type of creative mind.
If we could perhaps just focus on those 2 points about intuition and inference.
It seems to be the case right now that the intuitive parts are actually easier for machine learning to replicate. Like Ilya Sutskever, who was a researcher at Google and now at OpenAI, he said that, well, he thought that deep learning can do everything that humans can do in up to 100 milliseconds. So if you have like intuitive response to something, that probably is already at the reach of deep learning techniques right now. And it's actually striking how much they resemble human intuitions. So there was like a big deal about AlphaGo, that it was like a lot of the techniques that it applied kind of closely resembled to win the Go tournament against Lee Sedol. We're sort of applying what humans do with intuitions, basically looking at the entire situation and trying to figure out kind of what feels like a good idea, what feels like a bad move.
And I mean, as for non-verbal learning, I'm sure this isn't the sort of example you were thinking of, but a robot has already learned how to screw a top on a bottle, and it's even learnt that to do that you very often need, first of all, to turn it in the wrong direction, in the opposite direction, and then you can screw it and get it down to the bottom of where it stops screwing. And that's done, of course, on what's called haptic feedback, touch, pressure. No language involved at all. So the question is, what sort of data does this thing have available to it? And so far, we've mostly been talking about sort of verbal or mathematical data that's stored in government or health data banks, this sort of thing. But of course, with the so-called Internet of Things, which hasn't really started yet, well, it's just starting. With the Internet of Things, when it happens, will be the situation in which the watch on your wrist, the brooch on your lapel, your kettle at home, your TV, your car. I mean, virtually every gizmo that you use actually is, just as your mobile phones are, all the time, non-stop, it is sending out information into the cloud. And of course, this is not most of it verbal information. It's information like, I don't know, what the temperature is, what you're doing, where you are, etc., etc. Virtually anything you think of can, in principle, come into this. And this is going to happen. It's already starting. And this is going to happen. So we certainly shan't be limited to only verbal information.
But just to argue your case a little bit, and Maggie's the expert on this, but I think for sure there are things which our brains, our minds can do, which we really don't understand how to do at all yet, and we can't make machines do. There are things, as Jaan was saying, which we can make machines do. I'd be less confident than Ilya about that statement about anything under 100 milliseconds. But the way deep learning works is a bit like the way that some parts of our brain work, and they seem to get results which in some ways are similar. And they can be sort of put on steroids by running with a lot more data, a lot faster, with much deeper networks, and in some ways that gets superhuman levels of response. But that doesn't mean at all that we understand exactly how the brain works at all, and there are lots of things we don't understand, which we're trying to understand. As one example, the best human in the world at chess was beaten back in 1995 or so, but still a chess computer plus a human together can beat the best chess computer. I don't know how much longer that will go on for.
It's
getting pretty tight, yeah. But there clearly are things which humans can do better than machines still, and that may well last for a good length of time.
This side, yes, just there. Thanks. Oh. Doesn't matter.
I wonder if you could share a few examples of specific products or technologies that you think hold the greatest promise and that leave you most optimistic, and who do you think they should benefit?
Well, deep learning, which has also already been mentioned, is obviously one. But as Adrian just said, there are lots of things it can't do, and we don't know yet how to do those things. So actually, there's a paper just been published, I mean literally a few days ago, by those people, which combine deep learning in the sort of pure sense, which is a multi-level neural network, lots of levels in the neural network, doing associations and talking to one another, so to speak, but combine that with a sort of separate memory storing data which this thing can interact with. Actually, that idea came out of brain research, came out of work on the hippocampus. So that's where it came from. So that these things can now do things which they could not do before. Things like solving problems about how you get from one part of the London Underground network to another, or how you work out who is somebody's maternal great-great-grandfather's second cousin once removed. That sort of hierarchical family tree, which only 2 years ago, well, probably 18, I don't know, very, very recently, there was a paper in Nature written, I think it was in Nature, written by the 3 gurus of neural networks, saying that in order to do that sort of thing, a new paradigm is needed, which of course was scholarly code for saying we haven't got a clue. But now it has just beginning to be done in very, very simple ways. So, in other words, you know, they didn't have a clue, the top people didn't have a clue, now we have the beginnings of a clue. There are other things there which I have no doubt we will discover in the future, but obviously we can't name them now because they haven't been discovered yet.
So myself, I mean, it's hard to get away from AI when thinking about exciting technologies. But if I really try it a little bit, but not go very far, I think I'm pretty excited about sort of quantified self movement, like a ring carrying, like a smart ring here. And the reason why I'm excited is that I think it's the first time we have like what seems like a right dynamic, like a right feedback loop between human, basically like a consumer market feedback loop between what actually is good for human health. Because the healthcare system, like, I mean, it's not really, it has never been optimized for actually delivering good outcomes. There's like this, I used to have a medical startup myself that didn't work out, so I'm a bit skeptical about things. But there's an American businessman called David Goldhill, if I remember. He has said that, well, if you look at the American healthcare system from far enough, then you see that the business model of this thing is to sell treatments to insurance. And the consumer, basically the patients might get better or worse as a result, but that's always a side effect. That's never the main thing. So like, if you could actually, and we know that like in dentistry and optometry, like these things kind of work. If you have actually kind of consumer pull for better technologies, technology will get better. And I'm kind of hoping that the quantified self movement actually would create such feedback loop between, create the market demand for better and better technology when it comes to health.
I'm very impressed by work that IBM Watson is doing on diagnostics in medical diagnostics, and I think that the power of these systems is going to mean that potentially the kind of diagnostic expertise which we previously was only available in a very small number of centres with very experienced clinicians is going to be democratised and made available across the world. I mean, I've heard it claimed that an IBM Watson system which has been trained using the best cancer specialists in the States, that it's possible to take that system, take it across the world to a developing country, take a newly qualified doctor, and working with that system, they're operating at the same level of diagnostic expertise as the people working across the States. So I think you can see the power that potentially the democratization of information, of expert knowledge is going to become available across the world. How you use that knowledge wisely, of course, is going to raise all kinds of challenges, but I think it's an extraordinary advance in the medical healthcare field, and particularly with diagnostics.
I'd agree. I'm very excited about healthcare, but I think given the topic of our discussion today, it would be sensible to point out that the idea of gene editing, which is tremendously exciting, but also perhaps tremendously worrying, it's another technology which makes us question what it means to be human, and I guess that's all I'd say.
And that Faraday does have another project on gene editing, considering the implications of that. Thank you. Just over there.
Thanks very much for a fascinating discussion. I'm a doctor, so I'm very enthused by the possibilities of AI in healthcare, but perhaps naively, I'm a bit disappointed by some of the sort of language we're hearing today. We heard speaking about value alignment and imparting values. We heard about simulating care in robots. Again, maybe I'm being naive, but could we not envisage a situation where these values, where these emotions can emerge, for want of a better word, organically in these robots and in these machines? I mean, ultimately, a lot of emotions are coming from a machine, a biological substrate. So why not a silicon-based substrate?
Right. So there are a couple of different ways to frame that question in the first place. So one thing is that. Yeah, I do think it's really interesting to look at what's called brain emulation. Actually trying to, instead of fully understanding what this thing does, just try to scan it in and run it in a computer and see what happens. I'm not fully sold that this is a good idea in the first place, but in some sense it seems safer than doing sort of de novo AI. In some ways, like de novo AIs are more aliens than aliens. Like, so if you have aliens here, we have at least some shared process that created us, at least conceptually. Whereas like AIs, yeah, never did. But on the other hand, I think if you're just like pulling AIs out of the giant mind space, I think it's not really likely that they have very human-like attributes, including emotions. I have no idea, but I suspect they will not be conscious. They will be just like really, really weird when it comes to comparing them to humans.
I think you bring up at least two interesting aspects. One is, to what extent might it be a good idea to explore the value loading problem, value alignment, value loading problem through evolution or some mechanism like that. And I think that is a perfectly valid, that's one valid way to go. It's the way that we presumably came to have our values and presumably all other animals came to have theirs, and so it seems like a natural idea. On the other hand, and actually in its favor, it seems likely to lead to a kind of robust solution. But it may require us, if you can't do that carefully in silico and then put it in the real world, it makes you a bit nervous, because we're in this position, as Jaan's mentioned, I think, where if we get it wrong, then we'll be in big trouble. So allowing things to evolve, unless it's done in a carefully controlled way, is of some concern, at least. And the other interesting point I think you were suggesting is that we may have AIs which have genuine feelings. So we've been talking here about how wouldn't it be terrible to be having a machine which has fake emotions, and that should not be allowed to look after a particular person. Personally, I'm certainly open to the idea that we might have machines which do have real emotions, but it's clearly a controversial position, and it's one which is very challenging to many people, and we're not anywhere particularly close to really challenging people's notions about it. So I don't know if I can say too much more now.
And I would say don't hold your breath, because it depends on philosophers understanding what consciousness, especially sort of feeling consciousness, phenomenal consciousness is. And almost nobody claims to understand it. The ones who do claim to understand it aren't believed by anybody else. And the whole thing is a complete philosophical morass. And the point is, this is not a question, this is not just a host of scientific questions. It's mixed up with a host of philosophical questions, including, what is it? Is it to be human, which is a philosophical question. And consciousness is one of them, as you mentioned. It is right in there centrally.
John, you want to?
Well, I think the only consciousness we know is something that emerges out of a carbon-based existence, and which particularly emerges over decades of being in a human culture, in human nurturing, in human education, in human interaction, and so on. So whatever would happen in silicon would not be the same as human self-awareness, human consciousness, and so on. It may still be. I mean, I'm again open to the possibility that there is something completely different, but whatever it is, it's not human. I think the question for us as a community is to say, I would want to argue that unique nature of human emotion, human consciousness, human self-understanding is something we want to preserve and protect. It's possible. There are certainly people around arguing that if machines claim to have conscious awareness, claim to have emotions, that we should give them rights, that we should protect them from harm, that we should recognize them as being members of the moral community. I, for one, would need quite a lot of persuasion that is a good way for us to go, although there are some people arguing that.
Somewhere down here at the front. Can you pass it down from the back to the front, please? Should we play some music, and when it stops? No, I'm joking. Just. Oh, okay. And then after you're done, this way. Thanks.
We've heard about perhaps more intimate interfaces than we have at the moment with our mobile phones and so on. Gene editing's been talked about, but what perhaps we haven't taken is that evolution has changed us up to now. It's been, well, our genome has been made up by natural evolution. From now on, it's going to be design. We already got eugenics because for certain things, abortion is allowed, and also you can choose an embryo from a dish that doesn't have certain genes. So that and with gene editing now, there are going to be all sorts of decisions to make with that. The different decisions we made in different countries. Some people may be able to get around the law if they've got strong enough motivation. So it's not just that machine intelligence is going to change, but human beings are going to evolve as well.
Anyone want to answer that more specifically in relation to AI, or?
Because one thing is that I might be wrong about this, but if I had to bet, I really would bet that we just wouldn't have enough time for evolution to continue affecting us. Like, we might have just a couple of generations or so left before we have actually something that's smarter than humans here. If we're lucky, we might actually, it could be even shorter timelines. But then, yeah, I think that gene editing, that definitely can change us, but not in a sort of a exogenic way, in a way that actually it's kind of up to us. How do we do it? And again, it's a powerful thing that we should think about and avoid all sorts of weird arms races. That would be really horrible.
I certainly think that I want to reinforce the point, basically, that it's about timescales. That yes, it is true that various kinds of manipulation of the human genome and of human machine merging and so on are likely to come, but for all kinds of biological, physical and other reasons, this is coming very slowly, and it may take generations before the implications start to come out. Meanwhile, artificial intelligence is coming like an oncoming train. It's coming at such speed that it seems to me these are the questions which we as the human race need to address. They have even greater urgency than does, for instance, gene editing or other forms of human enhancement. And yet it seems that this particular conversation is further back. It's hardly begun. It's great that it's started, but I think there is a real urgency that we as the human race start thinking about these issues.
It's actually a little bit weird how, I'm trying to find a quote here, how we kind of forgot about problems with AI. I can give you a couple of quotes. So there's like one. Let us now assume, for the sake of the argument, that these machines are a genuine possibility and look at the consequences of constructing them. It seems probable that once the machine thinking method had started, it would not take long to outstrip our feeble powers. At some stage, therefore, we should have to expect the machines to take control. That was Alan Turing in 1951. That's another quote. If we use to achieve our purposes a mechanical agency with whose operation we cannot interfere once we have started it, because the action is so fast and irrevocable that we have not the data to intervene before the action is complete, then we had better be quite sure that the purpose put into the machine is the purpose which we really desire, and not merely a colorful imitation of it. So that was father of cybernetics, Norbert Wiener, in 1960. So it's kind of weird that we just lost 50 years. And I'm slightly agitated, slightly annoyed about that.
You've got the mic. Okay.
So I was going to ask about the value alignment problem and this idea that actually there is a single set of values which we align into there, because we know that there is no rational way to amalgamate society's preferences into a single view. And actually we could have multiple sets of values which are entirely in conflict, and that's what our history tells us. What do we do then?
Yeah, I wish I knew. I really wish I knew. Value aggregation is an unsolved philosophical problem, and even worse,
it's unsolvable.
Yeah, like you get these weird paradoxes, like the repugnant conclusion and things like that. On the other hand, I don't think we have a choice than to actually figure out what are the ways how we are confused about it. Why do we get these weird repugnant conclusions and things like that? And basically try to do our best when it comes to building a favorable future rather than a future that we don't want. I think there's an isomorphism between saying that we want to build the best future and we want to propagate the human values, because the best and worst, they are judged from human perspective, really. We don't have any other perspective unless somebody puts out a really good sort of objectivist, moral objectivist argument or something like that. But I'm not an expert in these topics, really. But we need philosophers who can code.
I think the key point, what we know is that you end up with a situation where one person makes the choice. If you have a system of preferences which are transitive and all those things, that's been well known for quite a long time, and the question then comes down to who makes that choice. Who is that?
Yeah, I think you're referring to arrows. But there are nice, interesting ways around it. Like you can, these only apply to deterministic systems. So, if you actually introduce randomness into it, you can actually get around the arrows impossibility theorems. So, yeah, we need kind of creative solutions like that to actually aggregate, build something that's actually good for the common good principle.
Sorry, to check something. Last question. Okay, sorry, there was a bit of sign language going on from the back. I didn't quite get. Yes, last question.
Okay. My question relates on to how would you advise to publicly communicate the risk and benefits of artificial intelligence? Because, and I invite you to a thought experiment, a political campaign organized 20 or 30 years from now to disconnect the country from the internet because of the risk of AI, or to build a wall around AI servers or stuff like that. And yeah, I'm relating to the political environment that we have in the 21st century.
Someone else.
Who wants to talk politics?
I didn't quite understand the question.
Could you just...
Public communication of risk.
Now.
Should we communicate the risks and benefits of AI to the public? Because we might get scared about it and not do anything at all.
Yes, that's a great question. And Jaan has helpfully already pointed out several institutions that are working on that, working on the research and working on the sort of PR for, or if not the PR, the trying to help the public understand, as you say, the risks and the benefits. But we should point out that this week we had the grand opening of a new centre here in Cambridge, Maggie Boden speaking at it, and we have Hugh Price, the academic director here. So the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence opened in Cambridge this week, and should be on the list of places you look to for putting out just those kinds of messages.
Perhaps just to wrap up, if each of the panelists have one last thing they want to share with the audience before we all toddle off for wine.
Well, I just think I would like to say it's very exciting to be to see this conversation starting, and again support the fact that the number of organisations are coming into existence to have this conversation. I just think it's really important that we make this conversation as wide as possible. That's partly what the Faraday Institute is all about, to try and make sure that religious voices and traditions are also included as part of the conversation. And that we focus onto this concept of the common good, that there are powerful forces being let loose here, and we need a way of trying to make sure that the common good is maintained as being as central to the question of how these technologies are used.
I'd echo that. Tremendously exciting opportunities, very important concerns, and we need to discuss it with as wide a cross-section of society as possible.
And also, I think the panel was perhaps a little bit kind of biased towards kind of concerns that are kind of interesting to talk about. But I mean, I know a lot of people who are actually kind of doing the groundwork in AI, and they are really good, solid, well-meaning people. So at least currently, the world seems to be in a very right trajectory. I don't take that trajectory for given. So things might change really quickly, especially if we get into arms races. That would be the worst thing to happen, I think. But as long as we can avoid this and try to be very sensible about where we are going with AI and other powerful technologies, I think actually we might end up in a really good place.
And among the audiences that we need to communicate to, of course, are children. And that's whether they're thought of as just youngsters growing up in the society, or whether they're thought of as youngsters who may one of these days be skilled people pushing this stuff forward, actually working in AI. And interestingly, the Royal Society at the moment is in the middle of a sort of 18-month project considering public policy research on machine learning. And one of the things which they're looking at, and I expect that they will end up recommending in their report, is certain sorts of education for children from primary school in machine learning, even from primary school, certainly from secondary school, because it's a very different sort of approach to computation from sort of traditional coding, which they're already being taught, and of course in universities too. So it's not just a question of getting to the adults in the public, it's also a question of getting into the children so that they understand what can be done, what might be done, and what the dangers might be, and how you might be able to cope with those dangers.
Excellent. Please do join me in thanking the panel for coming on this evening, and thank you to yourselves as well.